Pivot tables behave a bit differently than other Excel workbook elements, so you'll need to use a few slightly different techniques to select, move, copy, and delete them within your workbook. You can rename a pivot table by clicking any cell in the pivot table, and then on the Options contextual tab on the ribbon. In the pivot table group at the far left corner of the ribbon, you can type a new name for the pivot table. So in this case, I will call it Firm Revenue, and press Enter. This name will help you and other users interpret formulas that draw on this pivot table's data. If you want to clear all the fields, filters, and formats from a pivot table, you can do so again on the Options contextual tab. Click the Clear button, and then click Clear All. Doing so doesn't delete the pivot table. Instead, what it does is remove all the fields from the row area, column area, report filter area, and the values area so that you can rebuild it from the ground up. I'll put my fields back. So we have year, month, company, and revenue. If you want to create a second pivot table from the same data range, you can do that by copying and pasting the pivot table. So again, with any pivot table cell selected, on the Options contextual tab, click the Select button, and then click Entire Pivot Table. Now press Ctrl+C to copy the pivot table, and then select where you want to paste it. In this case, I will go to the PT Paste worksheet. Cell A1 is selected. I will now press Ctrl+V, and when I do, Excel paste in the pivot table. Now the two pivot tables work off the same data, but they are independent of each other. So for example, if I were to take the month field out of the row labels area on this version of the pivot table, and then switch back to the original pivot table, which is on the PT worksheet, you'll see that this pivot table is still in its original configuration. And I'll press the Escape key to remove the selection marquee from around the pivot table. If you want to copy a particular pivot table arrangement to another worksheet, but instead of creating a new pivot table, do so as a data, then you can do that by selecting the entire pivot table. And again, you do that by clicking any cell in the pivot table. Then on the Options tab, click Select, Entire Pivot Table, and then press Ctrl+C. That copies the pivot table to the clipboard. Now go to another worksheet, and in this case, I will go to Data Paste, and then with cell A1 selected, on the Home tab, I'll click the Paste button's down arrow, and then click the first icon in the Paste Values row. When I do, Excel pastes in the contents of the pivot table, but this time, instead of creating a pivot table, it only pastes the data. If you want to delete a pivot table, which I could do by switching back to the PT Paste worksheet and then clicking any cell in this pivot table, I can delete the pivot table by clicking Options, then select Entire Pivot Table and pressing the Delete key. With these techniques in mind, you'll be able to manage your pivot tables effectively.